They laughed when she told them a beauty product could be a passport. They laughed when she said clean scalps and gleaming hair could become a business plan, when she dared to put the words dignity and profit in the same sentence, when a washerwoman, with burned hands and a thinner purse, stood up and announced she would build an empire from bottles, brushes, and belief. The room did not see what she saw. It saw a woman speaking out of turn, in a trade it did not rate as serious, in an era that did not rate her as equal. But laughter is a currency that loses value when it's offered in place of vision. And Sarah Breedlove, whom the world would come to know as Madam C.J. Walker, had far more durable tender. The trust of her customers, the discipline of her craft, the multiplying force of women training women to carry the work forward. In a decade, the name stamped on her tins and jars would gleam from salon windows, kitchen tables, and traveling cases across the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America. The very people who sneered would find themselves standing in line, placing special orders and telling their daughters, "Sit still. This is the Walker system." The laughter quieted into something like respect, then into something even sturdier. A habit of buying, a muscle memory of care. A century later, the habit endures in drugstores and big box aisles, in online carts clicked before dinner, proof that a scoff can be melted down and reforged into an economy. This is a true story about racism and resolve, sexism and strategy, insults and invoices. It begins in the cotton fields and ends, in this chapter at least, in a factory hum and a training school, in wages paid and futures rewritten. It asks a simple hard question. When the world laughs at your dream, can you turn the sound into fuel and build so well that one day the laughter returns as a receipt? Her first name was Sarah, and the world into which she was born in 1867 was still learning the words for its own aftermath. The Civil War had burned out only 2 years earlier, the ink beneath the 13th Amendment barely dry. Her parents were formerly enslaved, farming Louisiana soil that kept secrets and debts. She was the first of their children born into legal freedom, and one of the first to learn how fragile such freedom could feel, especially after she was orphaned at 7. Childhood ended early. Survival began. By 14, she married. By 20, she was a widow with a baby on her hip, a young woman whose hands learned to carry other people's laundry and hopes in the same basket. She moved north to St. Louis in the 1890s because so many did, because the rumor of a steadier wage was sometimes enough to replace hunger with a plan. Days brought washboards and steam. Nights brought church basements where women organized, mutual aid, and taught each other how to tie money into kerchiefs, tucking a future beneath their blouses. In those rooms, she discovered 2 things that would guide the rest of her life: a community that believed in the power of self-presentation, as self-respect and the audacity of collective uplift. The body often tells a story before the mouth does. The harsh soaps, the stress, the poor diet, and the living conditions of black women in those years took their toll on scalps and hairlines. Sarah watched her hair thin and fall. She watched the mirror become a messenger she didn't like. This was not vanity. It was health. It was identity. It was power. She tried remedies that promised much and delivered little. Then, like many of her peers, she found relief in a gentler regimen of cleanliness, oiling, and care. Her curiosity thickened into study into method. St. Louis was also where she met an established pioneer in hair care, a woman whose business, model, and formulas offered instruction and a ladder. Training taught Sarah how to talk to clients, how to measure results, how to sell service and science together. But the mentorship was a beginning, not a boundary. She glimpsed the scale of what might be possible if the model were tailored to the precise needs and circumstances of the women she knew best. The racial climate that framed these experiments was ordinary cruelty. Colored cars on trains, back doors for black customers in restaurants, if they were admitted at all, boarding, houses that smiled until faces darkened their doorways. The law was not written for her, and the doors were not hung for her. Yet she traveled anyway, on church circuits, in women's clubs, at fairs and meetings. memorizing the places where hospitality outlasted habit, building an informal map of safety inside a national landscape that made no formal provisions for her comfort. She remarried, this time to a newspaperman, took his initials for her business name, and moved further west to refine the formulas that would become Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower. She gathered a method around the product: scalp preparation, shampoo, application of a soothing ointment, brushing, careful styling, and, as important as the steps themselves, instruction. This was not a jar in a box. This was teaching. When she later shifted her headquarters to Indianapolis, a rail hub and a city with a growing black middle class, she incorporated the company that bore her name. A factory, a salon, and a training school followed. She hired a team, then another, and another. She trained teachers to teach teachers, agents to train agents. She watched her daughter grow into a business partner and a hostess whose salons and salons without walls, the living rooms of friends, the back rooms of churches, became incubators for ideas about beauty, business, and liberation. The dream had moved from a rented room to an institution, and with it moved a whole generation of women whose hands, like hers, had known little but other people's laundry. Every movement forward, in that era, ricocheted off a wall. Sometimes the wall was a law, sometimes a person. Sometimes it appeared as a polite invitation to go away. In 1912, a convention room in Chicago delivered one of those walls. The National Negro Business League convened under the watchful eye of Booker T. Washington, the era's most prominent black businessman and educator, a man whose name could open or close 1,000 doors. The League's members were merchants and bankers, newspapermen and industrialists, men who wore their respectability like a uniform and whose definition of serious work sometimes excluded the labor women did to keep the community upright. Sarah, now Madam C.J. Walker, attended this summit of black enterprise with proof of concept under her arm. Ledgers, testimonials, trained agents by the dozens, then hundreds. She asked to speak. She was rebuffed. The reasons were as old as they were: thin, a crowded program, a misunderstanding, perhaps the tacit belief that a business in hair and beauty belonged at the edge of things. In that refusal, the intersection of racism, sexism, and class pretensions found a neat, infuriating expression. So she did what leaders do when the door's shut and the building is theirs too. She stood. She introduced herself. She spoke into the room's disapproval and placed her story on the table like a contract. She had come from fields and wash basins to a factory and a payroll. She had organized a sales force of black women, taught them a trade, and given them not just commissions, but a new spine. She was not asking permission to exist. She was presenting the results of having existed at scale. The air changed. Even those predisposed to discount her saw the numbers and listened to the line of women standing behind them. Respect, withheld as a kind of currency, began to circulate. This was not a single dramatic insult resolved by a single charismatic speech. It was one scene among many. Consider the train platform at dusk, when the segregated car jerked forward before the porter could help lift her sample case. Consider the hotel lobby in a town that prided itself on hospitality, offering her a room only after she insisted, and then directing her to an entrance by the kitchen. Consider the restaurant where she was invited as a donor to a cause, then told that the main dining room was unavailable, though it sighed with empty chairs. The refrain always was some variant of propriety. The justification always was some version of tradition. The effect always was the same, the attempt to turn a woman into her place. There were incidents, too, inside the black community. As her business grew, rivalries emerged. The woman who had trained her earlier in St. Louis felt betrayed. Markets got crowded, agents competed, rumors and lawsuits followed. When the world provides few legitimate mechanisms for resolving disputes, between black women in business, illegitimate ones proliferate. Through it all, Madam Walker did the thing the moment required. She kept building. She improved her formulas. She standardized training. She demanded courtesy from her agents and gave it in her advertisements. She positioned her company not as The only path, but as the path she was accountable for keeping clear. The largest, most violent incident of that era was always waiting. News reports, distilled violence printed in cold type, arrived with grim regularity. A lynching here, a mob there. The banality of evil is that it repeats itself until people treat repetition as inevitability. She refused that habituation. She gave, she organized, she spoke out. The terror was not separate from hair care. It was the background against which black women did everything. If a hairdresser came to your home, she brought oil for your scalp and news for your ears. Which road to take, which county to avoid, which church was raising money for a girl whose father had been taken. Business was not a firewall against terror. It was the means by which a community kept its breathing steady. And in the midst of racist travel, sexist dismissals, internecine competition, and national terror, she took on a task few dared, asserting that beauty work was nation work. If the nation excluded you from its public self-image, you made the mirror your studio and the salon your parliament. She told women to lift their eyes from the basin and look straight into their reflection. Yes, the instructions said, we will wash and brush and oil, but we will also plan. Resistance in her hands looked like curriculum. She built a system and wrote it down. She taught it, licensed it, iterated it. Agents learned the hygiene of the method, shampooing, massaging the scalp, applying ointment, brushing, but they also learned the economics, how to price fairly, how to book appointments, how to keep books, how to save. In training classes named after her daughter, they practiced both there and then skills and here and now survival, how to travel safely between towns, how to arrange group demonstrations, through clubs and churches, how to read a room and turn a skeptical crowd into paying clients. She designed uniforms and badges because professionalism was not only a look, it was armor. In towns eager to belittle black women at every turn, a crisp blouse, a satchel organized, like a surgeon's tray, and an introduction delivered with calm authority could disarm mockery. In a country determined to extract unpaid labor from black women, she insisted on paydays. She delivered sample kits and catalogs because the industry's incumbents had not bothered to make materials for her market. She ran full-page ads in black newspapers that not only sold products but praised the economic independence of her agents, signaling to others, this is what a paycheck can look like. Her factory, humming at the edge of Indianapolis, did not only make goods, it staged a drama in which black workers filled every role. Office staff handled orders. Customer service answered questions from Alabama to Oklahoma, and a print shop churned out leaflets in which the ink spelled both ingredients and a manifesto. She paid wages that turned rented rooms into owned homes, and helped agents move from cash in hand to money in bank. The network of Walker agents, as they came to be known, grew into the thousands. In city after city, they became pillars, paying church tithes, sponsoring reading circles, underwriting school scholarships, buying Liberty bonds, organizing relief when disaster hit. Her resistance also took the form of rooms. She built a house on a high hill that looked like it belonged to the future, the kind of place even the wealthy did not expect a black woman to inhabit. It became a salon in the old sense of the word, a room where ideas were entertained, alliances forged, art appreciated. Writers, musicians, activists passed through. Meetings took place under chandeliers designed by men who had never planned for their light to fall on such a gathering. She hosted, but she also listened. She invited skeptics and friends alike. If institutions would not give her a seat at the table, she would build a table so large and set it so well that people had to reconsider what rooms were for. When Washington, D.C. or New York called for funds to fight the terror staining the Sioux nation, she did not let the checkbook gather dust as a display piece. She opened it. Some found this unbecoming in a woman. Others found it threatening in a black woman. She found it necessary. She insisted that her agents reflect that ethic too. In company circles, prizes were awarded not only for top sales, but for charitable giving and community service. Resistance. She taught, is not only refusing, it is also providing. And when men, sometimes in her own community, questioned whether beauty was serious business, she invited them to tour the factory. She put ledgers on the desk. She pointed them to the post room, where orders stacked like a topography of need. She introduced them to workers whose children's school fees were paid because hair had grown back. Yes, but also because dignity had returned with it. Beauty, she reminded them, had been weaponized against black people for centuries. Reclaiming and profiting from the reclamation was serious indeed. None of this was neat. She suffered betrayals and business reversals. Suppliers shorted shipments. Agents defected. Rivals poached. She had to make payroll when the month's receipts ran thin. Her marriage frayed and ended. She learned up close that being a boss was a particular kind of loneliness. She also learned that the cure for such loneliness was building institutions sturdy enough that no one person's departure collapsed the roof. Climax is often imagined as a singular moment, a cymbal crash accompanied by the wave of a conductor's arm. In her story, the turning points orchestrated themselves into a sequence that sounded more like a symphony than a solo note. The first crescendo came in Chicago when she took the podium that hadn't been offered and made of it a pulpit. The people, in that room, men who had thought themselves patrons of the race's progress, watched a woman prove that progress has many faces. That scene reverberated outward, at the next convention, and the next church meeting, and the next banker's office. A door cracked a little wider because of what she had done in that hour. The second crescendo played out in factories and homes across the Midwest. The day the Indianapolis plant fired its boilers and the first labeled tins of pomade slid into crates, the air in that neighborhood changed. The neighborhood's children watched deliveries and understood that their elders had made something out of thin air, jobs that were not subservient, wages that came with respect, and a routine that dignified the morning commute instead of diminishing it. The hum of production is a music that never quite stops once it begins. It rang in the ears of those who route-planned shipments and those who counted the money, those who mopped the floors and those who answered letters with advice about itching, scalps and broken ends. The third crescendo happened under a different kind of roof, one meant for leisure and strategy. Her house on the hill filled with people who had spent their lives in rooms where their beauty was ignored and their minds underestimated. The evening air within those walls tasted like possibility. Plans were hatched, some about hair, some about art, some about law. Activists found donors, young poets found mentors, visitors who had doubted found themselves doubting their doubts. The final crescendo of her own lifetime sounded in a concert hall, where she pledged a gift to a cause that stretched beyond her ledger: the fight against lynching and for federal insistence on the value of black life. A business built on care extended its care beyond the body, beyond the salon, into the nation's conscience. It was a pivot from "this is how we live" to "this is whether we live." There was, too, the quieter turning point, less immediate but no less profound. A generation of women looked at their hands and did not see servitude. They saw skill. They saw wages earned and saved, a dress bought for church without panic, a plot of land purchased without apology. When a person inside a system designed to minimize her acquires the habit of saying, "I can," history registers the key change. Madam Walker's life was not long. She died in 1919, leaving behind a wake of decisions that continued steering long after the boat had docked. She wrote a will that spoke as firmly as she had on public stages, directing money toward institutions, scholarships, and the causes that had anchored her. She left a business robust enough to endure setbacks and ownership transitions, and a daughter prepared to carry both legacy and ledger into the next decade. Her company's sales would crest and dip as all companies do, but the culture she created proved more resilient than any seasonal downturn. The women she trained others. The hair care industry, once uninterested in the needs of black customers, took notice, first to compete, then to copy. The phrase Walker agent remained a shorthand for competence long after the phrase no longer referred to a single brand's sales force. The Walker system became a byword for both technique and approach. Treat the person, not just the problem. Teach as you sell. Organize what you learn into something others can use. In the years after her death, the house on the hill hosted gatherings that reached deeper into the arts and civil rights. It became a symbol as well as a space, a place where a black woman's success was not an anomaly, but an anchor, a demonstration that wealth could be wielded as a tool rather than hoarded as a trophy. Her factory anchored a neighborhood and a narrative that black enterprises could be capitalized, employed, scaled. Across decades, the market matured, fractured, consolidated, and renewed. In one era, her brand name rested, then returned under different corporate umbrellas and strategies, adapting formulations and packaging to contemporary tastes while repeating the original promise: respect for textured hair and the people who wear it. Shelves that had once offered nothing, or worse, harmful somethings, began to feature options created with care. Her story did not own those developments, but it helped shape the moral of the market. Where there is neglect, there is opportunity. Where there is opportunity, there must be integrity. Her philanthropy's echo did not fade. The organizations she supported expanded, rebranded, merged, and continued the work. The college scholarships extended the arc of possibility into families that had not imagined higher education before a sales commission paid for a first semester. The respectability politics that once tried to push her to the margins softened in the face of outcomes that rendered arguments moot. The men who had once scoffed found their daughters' hair glowing in the mirror and their wives' incomes paying the mortgage. And in the ordinary flow of 100,000 days, something that had been exceptional became normal. Black women. Buying products designed honestly for their hair, from companies that at least acknowledged their existence. The sight that once astonished, a black woman at the head of a boardroom table making a budget decision, became less rare. Each instance of new normalcy carries a trace of those who made it possible. The trace in this case smells faintly of pressed hair and ointment, the scent of a century of mornings made calmer by a method that began in the determined hands of a woman others had laughed at. The laugh is the easiest part to picture. It's the beginning of so many stories, especially those in which the protagonist is a black woman with an audacious plan. The laughter says, "Your dream is smaller than our imagination of you." The rest of the story proves the opposite. Their imagination was smaller than her dream. What can we carry away that is more than admiration? First, that self-respect and enterprise are not enemies. In a world where discrimination insists on smallness, building a business that dignifies your customer is a form of justice. Second, that training is a multiplier. Teach one person a skill, and you gain a worker. Teach that person to teach, and you gain a workforce. Third, that philanthropy is not a prize you announce after you win. It's a habit you bake into your systems while you're still building. Fourth, that beauty, so long used against black people as the site of insult and exclusion, can be reclaimed as a site of health, power, and revenue. If you are a builder with hands that still smell of other people's doubt, let this be your sign. Stand up in the room that does not want to hand you the microphone and speak. Show your ledgers. Show your people. Show your plan. If you are in a position to invest, buy, mentor, or hire, remember this. Every time a gatekeeper snickers, a great company dies unborn. Hold the gate differently. And if you are a customer, remember that buying can be a ballot you cast daily, electing the kind of market and community you want to live in. They laughed at her dreams. She taught the world to buy them instead, daily, quietly, with the untheatrical faith of routine. Somewhere, this morning, a jar is opened. A scalp is soothed. A mirror smiles back. That is how you answer ridicule, with results so consistent they turn into culture.